sidewalks and streets.
A pet trade that few regulations truly.
However, is that eradication is not a realistic goal. The species is too widely distributed, too reproductively productive, and too behaviorally adaptable to be eliminated from a landscape as fragmented and human-modified as South Florida. The actual management target is suppression to tolerable levels, reducing populations sufficiently to minimize structural damage, ecological disruption, and public health concerns without expecting to remove the species entirely. That is a fundamentally different kind of success than elimination, and it requires a fundamentally different kind of commitment. Not a campaign with an endpoint, but a permanent, ongoing balancing act between human pressure and biological resilience. The millions of iguanas that have been disappearing from certain parts of Florida are telling a story that is ultimately about ecological complexity. The real predator in this story is not a single animal, not a government program, not a cold front. It is the accumulated weight of multiple pressures working in concert. Raccoons destroying nests in the dark, owls taking juveniles at dusk, cold fronts paralyzing thousands at once, and coordinated human removal filling in the gaps, finding traction in specific places at specific moments. South Florida's iguana problem is not solved. But for the first time, in certain canal corridors and suburban neighborhoods, the balance is beginning to shift. And understanding exactly why it is shifting there, and not elsewhere, may be the most important ecological question the region faces in the decades ahead. Sonnet 4.6 Low. Reflecting climatic fluctuation. The underlying invasion state of the system does not change because of cold mortality alone. It merely oscillates around a high baseline. What is actually driving the localized population declines that researchers are now documenting is not any single one of these forces operating alone. It is the simultaneous interaction of all of them in specific geographic areas, combined with intensified and better coordinated human management in those same zones. In areas where raccoon populations are healthy and active, where canal corridors support resident raptor pairs, where cold events have occurred in recent winters, and where professional removal services have operated continuously rather than sporadically, the combined pressure has been sufficient to produce measurable and sustained reductions in local iguana numbers. The key word is local. Statewide, the population remains enormous. But the evidence that meaningful suppression is achievable under the right combination of conditions is now stronger than it has ever been, and that matters scientifically even when the overall picture remains daunting. The path forward that wildlife scientists and management agencies are currently developing reflects the complexity of this problem clearly. Nest detection and destruction in high-density zones has emerged as the most cost-effective intervention strategy, because targeting reproduction removes entire future cohorts rather than single adults. Coordinated regional removal programs that operate simultaneously across interconnected urban corridors, rather than at the property-by-property level, are being prioritized over fragmented private demand culling. Urban design reform, reinforcing canal infrastructure against burrowing, replacing iguana-favored ornamental vegetation with less palatable native species, and modifying seawalls and embankments to reduce basking and nesting suitability, addresses the habitat drivers that make South Florida so hospitable to iguanas in the first place. Experimental approaches including fertility control research and behavioral deterrent technologies are under active investigation, and drone-based and camera trap monitoring networks are becoming more sophisticated in tracking population distribution and movement patterns in real time. Something strange is happening in the waterways and suburban backyards of South Florida. A creature that once seemed completely unstoppable, multiplying across seawalls, golf courses, canal banks, and residential gardens by the hundreds of thousands, is beginning to thin out in certain areas. Camera monitoring systems, field surveys conducted by university researchers, and long-term ecological observation sites scattered across Miami-Dade and Broward counties are recording something that wildlife managers barely dared to hope for just a decade ago: localized population declines in green iguana numbers. But the story behind this shift is not what most people expect. It is not a government program that cracked the code. It is not a new technology or a revolutionary culling method. The answer, as is so often the case in ecology, is far more layered, more ancient, and more surprising than anything humans deliberately designed. To understand what is actually happening, you have to go back to the very beginning of this invasion. The green iguana's story in Florida starts in the late 1960s, during a period when the exotic pet trade operated with almost no regulatory oversight. Shipments of tropical wildlife arrived in Florida ports regularly, and among the most popular items were juvenile green iguanas, small and manageable lizards native to the tropical forests stretching from southern Mexico through Central America and down into Brazil. Miami became the epicenter of this trade, and inevitably, animals escaped or were deliberately released by owners who underestimated how large and difficult these creatures would become. By the early 1970s, scattered sightings were being reported in suburban neighborhoods, but nobody took them seriously as a long-term ecological concern. That was a serious miscalculation. Florida's subtropical climate turned out to be an almost perfect match for a species evolved in tropical lowland forests. Winter temperatures across South Florida rarely dropped far enough for long enough to threaten iguana survival, and the landscape offered something even better than their native environment in one crucial way: an endless supply of ornamental vegetation planted specifically to be lush, green, and nutritious. Hibiscus, bougainvillea, fruit trees, and flowering garden plants became an all-you-can-eat buffet spread across millions of residential properties. The canal systems built for flood control unintentionally created linear wildlife corridors stretching for hundreds of miles, giving iguanas protected movement routes between populations. By the late 1980s, breeding populations had stabilized and begun expanding. By the 1990s, they were pushing northward into Broward and Palm Beach counties. By the early 2000s, wildlife agencies were documenting densities that genuinely alarmed researchers. More than 100 individuals per hectare in some urban edge zones, a density more typical of small mammals or bird colonies than large lizards. The reproductive mathematics behind this explosion are staggering when you sit with them carefully. A single female green iguana produces between 20 and 70 eggs in a single clutch, and in Florida's extended warm season, many females manage to lay more than once per year. Even accounting for the high juvenile mortality that is normal in reptile populations, sometimes exceeding 70 or 80% in the first year of life. The sheer volume of eggs being deposited across the landscape every season creates a population surplus that continuously outpaces natural attrition. The system, in ecological terms, is not just self-sustaining. It is aggressively expansionary, stacking new generations faster than any combination of predators, cold weather, or human removal efforts can drain them away. Asymmetrical ear placement to triangulate sound with extraordinary precision in darkness, meaning the faint rustle of a juvenile iguana repositioning itself on bark or shifting toward a nighttime roost can trigger a strike before the animal registers any threat. Juvenile iguanas face their peak vulnerability window during the transition between daylight basking and nocturnal roosting. As light levels drop, they must move, and that movement is where owls concentrate their hunting effort. Observational data from urban wildlife monitoring programs confirms that these attacks are highly efficient when conditions align correctly. In canal-lined corridors of Broward and Miami-Dade counties where resident owl pairs establish hunting territories, juvenile iguana mortality can be measurably elevated compared to similar habitats without that predator presence. The limitation is distributional. Owl territories are tied to nesting sites and canopy structure, not to iguana density, so this predation pressure is geographically patchy rather than system-wide. Then there is the force that dwarfs every predator in terms of raw mortality numbers, and it requires no hunting skill whatsoever. Temperature. Green iguanas are ectotherms, meaning their entire physiology depends on external heat sources to function. When ambient temperatures approach or drop below 10 degrees Celsius, their muscle function slows toward paralysis. They lose the ability to grip branches. They fall from trees. They lie motionless on sidewalks, fences, and canal edges, appearing lifeless to observers who have never witnessed the phenomenon before. These cold stunning events have been extensively documented in Florida wildlife records, particularly during unusual winter cold fronts that periodically push far enough south to affect Miami-Dade County and surrounding regions. During significant cold events, the mortality numbers are not marginal. They can be genuinely massive, with thousands of animals dying or sustaining physiological damage across a single cold episode. Biologists and wildlife managers who have studied these events describe them as temporary but powerful population resets in affected areas. The critical complication, however, is that cold mortality is not a controlled or reliable management tool. These cold events are irregular, geographically uneven, and followed by rapid population rebounds in the warm seasons that follow. A cold snap that kills thousands of iguanas in one winter can be followed by 2 or 3 warm years in which reproductive output restores populations close to pre-event levels. This cyclical pattern has sometimes been misread as evidence that population control is working when it is actually. Sites are geographically predictable, which is exactly the kind of vulnerability that an intelligent, adaptable omnivore like a raccoon is built to exploit. Using highly sensitive olfactory detection, raccoons locate freshly disturbed soil or faint organic traces left during egg deposition and systematically excavate nests. A single raccoon can destroy an entire clutch of 20 to 70 eggs within minutes. Field experiments conducted in Florida ecosystems have demonstrated the scale of this regulatory role in dramatic terms. When raccoon access to nesting areas was blocked through exclusion fencing or localized removal, iguana hatchling survival rates increased sharply, in some monitored plots doubling or tripling within a single breeding season. This establishes raccoons not merely as occasional predators, but as genuine gatekeepers controlling how many individuals actually enter the iguana population each year.